Let's move on and get some analysis of the situation. We're joined by Rana, Professor of the History and Politics of Modern China at the University of Oxford and Director of the University China Centre. Thank you for being with us. I'm wondering, from your perspective, what do you think China is hoping to get from these games?
I think China's aim has been to try and reproduce what happened about a decade and a half ago in 2008, the Summer Olympics that Beijing held, which were a huge soft power win for China, really a sort of coming out party to the outside world, as people expressed it. Now, in practice, the political difficulties between the two sides, the Western world and China, have meant that this Games will not have that same sort of effect. Also, of course, COVID has got in the way of allowing the world to actually visit China during the proceedings of these Games. But I think they still hope through television and through China winning an awful lot of medals that they'll give the impression of a strong, nationally proud China that they very much want to project to the outside world.
Indeed, that medal total could be very important in that kind of perspective, couldn't it? But in terms of the boycott, the international boycott that's taking place, I mean, Vladimir Putin is the VIP guest, I suppose, the big name that's going to be in the grandstand watching what goes on, and of course, politicking with Xi Jinping. Is this boycott such a blow, or is the Western media kind of making more of it, do you think? Do you think China's actually not too bothered that there is this boycott?
I think China's not particularly bothered about the diplomatic boycott, which is what's been happening. If the athletes were actually not taking part, that would be much more of an issue, because, of course, that would mean that there'd be a very visible manifestation on television screens of major winter sports nations not actually taking part. And it's worth noting that the majority of countries that do well in the winter sports are Western democratic countries like Norway, Sweden, Canada. So the fact that they're taking part, in a sense, makes the Chinese point. Beyond that, though, as you mentioned, the Russian connection is important. They're huge in winter sports, of course, very cold, frozen country across much of the territory, but also the opportunity for Xi Jinping to make the huge gesture of the first foreign leader in 2 years that he's met in person during the pandemic being Vladimir Putin. Well, as television images go, that's much more valuable than the boycotting of some diplomats who probably aren't really very well known in China in the first place.
Indeed, I imagine that Putin and Xi Jinping will be talking Ukraine. There's been the announcement of this gas deal, some $80 billion worth being sent. It's a Rosneft deal, Russia to China, gas being sent there. But also the word coming out about Xi Jinping agreeing with Putin about putting the brakes on any expansion of NATO. And clearly there's another echo of what's going on in Ukraine, with one of Russia's key demands being that Ukraine not be allowed to join NATO. What is Xi Jinping trying to do here, do you think?
Well, Mark, there's what's going on and what's not being said as well. All the things you pointed out are exactly right. And the $80 billion gas deal is very important for China in terms of getting the economy growing and economic growth, although how it fits in with China's green targets is not so clear to me, because, of course, it's yet more fossil fuel. But it's worth noting, China agreeing about Russia's position on NATO, agreeing about the West being an aggressive set of countries, is not the same thing as a formal alliance. In other words, whatever the language and however warm it is, this is not the beginning of an Asian NATO of authoritarian states. China is still very wary about making formal commitments to Russia in terms of military incursions, and actually, to be honest, vice versa as well. And there are some areas, Central Asia in particular, where China and Russia have rival claims rather than necessarily cooperative ones. So while this new friendliness is real and has some strategic advantages, we shouldn't mistake it, I think, for the beginning of a very formal alliance of the kind that we've seen for years and years in NATO in Europe, or back in the Cold War days, the Warsaw Pact that the Soviet Union used to run.
Indeed. You mentioned, Rana, earlier in the interview about the 2008 Summer Games. I was fortunate enough to cover those at France 24, and I really picked up on what you've pointed out about the soft power elements of that, and about the way China was really trying to welcome people in, and they really took care of us in the best possible way. This time around, 2022, do you think there's a difference in the way China's approaching things? Maybe less of a complex about trying to change people, more of kind of accepting things on their own terms?
Yes, from the point of view of certainly the Western world, and bearing in mind for winter sports, it's mainly Western and richer countries that tend to take part. The global South, Africa, South America tend to be less involved in these sports. Back in 2008, you'll remember, Mark, the slogan was "Beijing welcomes you," "Beijing 欢迎你" in Chinese. These days, the official slogan may be welcoming, but the message under the surface, particularly to foreign journalists, seems to be much more Beijing will let you in, but if you try and report on human rights or other issues we don't like, then we're going to give you a very hard time. In other words, as you say, China previously was trying to get a warmer face from the wider world. Now China thinks that it has a powerful enough role in the world. It doesn't really need to spend too much time worrying about what much of the Western world has to say. That's a big shift.
And among the torch carriers, a Uyghur.
Yes, symbolically very important from the Chinese point of view, because what they would want to argue is that there are significant members of the Uyghur minority who still essentially follow the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party. And of course, people like Communist Party secretaries do exist within the Uyghur minority population. But it is a distraction move because they still haven't really head-on addressed what a lot of evidence has shown, which is that large numbers of so-called re-education camps, in fact, holding camps, in which Uyghurs have been held in their certainly tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. The figures aren't clear, but they're very large. That point is simply being rejected by China, and the use of a Uyghur torch holder is a symbolic gesture, but it's not an answer to the questions which much of the rest of the world, including parts of the Muslim world, actually, as well as the Western world, have been asking for quite some time now.
Indeed, it's something we've reported on here at France 24, and we've had countless people from the Chinese side of things really trying to sort of put this into a box and forget about it or just deny it completely. Can I just leave with one conclusion? Sport and politics don't mix, is what many people have said. Here, they seem to be inseparable, don't they?
1936 Berlin Olympics, 1980 the Soviet Olympics boycotted by the Americans, 1984 the Soviets in turn didn't go to the LA Olympics during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. There's always been a link between sports and politics. Even back to the original Olympic Games in ancient Greece were about a truce during a war, but the war was real as well as the truce.
Rana, Professor of History and Politics of Modern China, Oxford University. Thank you, sir, very much indeed.